Welcome back to Historical Projects, a community podcast exploring project success and leadership. I'm David. Today, I want to take you inside the remarkable story of La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, or Barcelona. It's one of the world's most iconic architectural projects, not only for its breathtaking design, but for the extraordinary journey behind its construction. This is a project defined by vision, resilience, and the belief that some creations are meant to outlive their creators. To help us unpack this remarkable story, I'm joined by Derek Hannigan. Now, Derek is a general manager with over 30 years of experience across mining, energy, and renewables and gas. He holds a Bachelor of Engineering from Sydney University and an MBA from Deakin, and has held senior executive roles leading everything from complex commercial projects and major infrastructure delivery to strategy, transformation, and business development. Derek brings a rare combination of technical rigor, commercial depth, and strategic instinct, and a genuine passion for connecting the lessons of history to the challenges modern leaders face. Derek, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here. La Sagrada Familia is just a great topic to talk about. It's got great history, and it shows you that, vision and human ambition can converge to produce these magnificent monuments that live on through the ages. So I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you. I've got to say that whenever I travel, I'm always keen to look inside the churches of the places I visit, sometimes to the distress of my family, who eventually get sick of so many in Europe. But you always learn a little bit about the history of the place, and it's great to sort of experience the vibe of these buildings. They're all unique. They've all got a different sort of feel about them.
So, Derek, when you first encountered La Sagrada Familia, whether in person or in photos, what impression did it leave on you?
I'm sure I probably did see it in photos through my life, and it's been on TV plenty of times, but I actually visited the building last June with my wife and my two youngest kids. And we were lucky enough that we stayed only a very short walk from the building, and we had a direct view of the building from our little balcony. So for 4 nights, before I went to bed, I went and looked out over this building. And I guess the build up to knowing that I was going to see the building meant I did a bit more research. It was quite a build up of expectations about seeing it. And I think because we stayed close by for 4 nights, every day we sort of saw it. We often walked around it. We saw it at different times of the day. And then eventually we went inside for a tour. And we knew that we wanted to go into the afternoon. We'd heard the stories about the afternoon light coming through the stained glass windows as being something that you had to see. Wasn't sure if I was ever going to get back there again, so I wanted to make sure I saw that. And it really did live up to expectations. So, when we eventually got inside and saw the effect of the light through those stained glass windows, it's just mesmerising. And you're surrounded with other tourists and travellers who are going through the same experience. So there's sort of sense of standing in a crowd that are just all a sense of wonder, looking up at this light. It's really probably hard to put into words just how it makes you feel as we sort of go on that experience. And that the interior of the place is also amazing as you look up through the columns as it's sort of like the reverse of trees. It's like all the roots are sort of coming up and holding the roof aloft. I guess as a civil engineer that spent a fair bit of time sort of having to work out how to keep buildings up, I'd hate to have done the calculations to keep that building up. It is such a novel construction. I've got a good collection of photos now. All of Barcelona, and I'll keep pronouncing it like an Aussie. It has, Gaudí is sort of dominant across the landscape. So we went and visited Gaudí's park. We went inside some of the buildings that he was commissioned. They're all unique, but you can see his design intent. So I felt like I got to know him pretty well. Inside the place, there's a little bit of a museum, so you can get a bit more of a background about how he took on the project and the experiments he did. It was just an amazing experience. I think, when you stand outside of it and go, they've been building this thing for 140 years and it's still not finished. At night, I looked at it and there's a crane lit up right beside it. So you always have this sense of under construction. I think just this year they finished the last tower and put this sort of cross on the top. So all the towers are now complete. But yeah, what an amazing building, and so much history to talk about today.
Derek, when I first saw it, I've been fortunate to travel a lot, see a lot of buildings, and I remember going and almost didn't go in thinking, oh, like it's just another church. And it is incredible. And the way they describe inside like a forest. And I thought of Star Wars. I just thought of these amazing images. Oh, it's fantastic. It is an incredible building. It's great you're here to tell us all about it. So, Derek, let's start at the beginning. Now, I know the story begins in 1882 when construction started under architect Francesco di Paola di Villa. But within a year, the project shifted dramatically when a young visionary named Antonio Gaudí took over. Now, we know he transformed the original neo-Gothic plan into something entirely new, a fusion of Gothic Revival, Art Nouveau, and his own deeply symbolic, nature-inspired style. And I agree with the nature. It comes out. Gaudí believed that the basilica should be a Bible in stone, with every facade, tower, and sculpture telling a story. He devoted the last 40 years of his life to it, living on site in his final years. Now, when he died in 1926, only a small portion was complete, but his vision was so meticulously documented that future generations could continue the work. Derek, is there an element of Gaudí's design that resonates with you on a personal level?
Whether it's resonate or whether it just sort of highlights sort of the contrast to my own engineering experience, one of the things about this building is there's pretty much no straight lines. So, his rejection of straight lines is pretty interesting. I'm a civil engineer and I've worked with lots of straight lines. Most of what you do is about, being efficient and making it a straight line. And, by contrast, when you go through Europe and, the Romans conquered everything, they're known for making these really straight lines across the countries that they conquered. Their roads are really straight. But this building is really organic. I think he said there's no straight lines in nature. And so when you're inside the building and you look up and you see all the branching columns, you understand what he meant. They are the strangest looking columns I've ever seen inside of a building, and you can spend a lot of time just looking at it. Now, I think I've spoke about the effect of the lights, but the facades on this building are so complex, and the Bible stories that are woven into it. I think that was the beauty of having someone take you on a tour to stand outside and actually explain and narrate the various sides of the building and the meanings of, the sculptures. It's you spend a lot of time just standing outside looking at the facade and piecing together a story. A light effect he's also linked a story into that. So one side sort of blues and greens, and that's meant to be the side for birth. And the side that is the orange and the yellows and golds is meant to be more about the end of life, the passion. So it's meant to represent death, but it's hard when you're in there to associate with death because it's just such a beautiful vision. So I'm not so sure that I can see the connection to the sort of the passion story. But my kids were completely transfixed by the light through the windows, which sort of tells them something about the experience. One of the other things I find fascinating for someone who works in strategy is like the evidence of Gaudí's systems thinking. A lot of his experiments that he did, and he's pretty much used what nature has sort of delivered over billions of iterative refinement as part of his design template, rather than just going from first principles. And when you go and see how he built the models and experimented with some of his construction techniques, you really get to see the artistry of what he's, I guess, delivered, or what people delivered for him, I guess, is the right story, because he didn't get that far. And but the really interesting bit is his vision was so clear that the people who came after him could be recruited to it. And so you say the good vision is one that can, survive the original party. And, that's clearly what this building's done. It's a multi-generational project that's gone well beyond the originator.
When I think of it, Derek, what amazes me is it is so different to all the other churches or basilicas I've seen. And for him to have it detailed so people could follow that, because all the people following would have just been trained in the traditional way of building things. But for him, look, It's incredible. I really want people to go and look at this or go on the internet, and you'll see what Derek and I are just completely amazed about. Now, Derek, if we look now, what's the role and the purpose of the church in your mind today?
It's a little bit unique in that it was conceived as a penitential temple, which means it's funded by public donations rather than being something that's being funded by the state or by church. And I guess that gives it a different relationship with the people that sit around it. So this multi-generation relationship the church has with the people that interact with it because they've all had a part in sort of funding it. And it's now become, a symbol of Barcelona's creativity and its identity. And you can see it just about anywhere, you stand in the city, you've got, you get sneaking views of it. So, yeah, I think it's gone well beyond what it was originally conceived of in just the church. It's become sort of part of the brand of the city. And the numbers of people that visit this are just amazing. So I think in the year before I visited, there was 4.8 million people, and about almost 90% of them came from outside Spain. I think when you go down the list, I don't think Australia sort of appears on the top of it, but it gets a lot of visitors from all over the world. And the amount of money that it generates is also astounding. I found a fact that said it was like 134 million euro revenue last year, entirely from private sources. And over half of that then goes back into construction. And that was just the direct income from building. So when you look at all of the other sort of economic benefit that flows into the city from the visitors and the restaurants and motels, it's just an enormous sort of like a value creator for the city.
Thanks, Derek. Now, the construction, I know, has stretched across generations. It's been shaped by wars, funding shortages, and evolving building techniques. The Spanish Civil War destroyed many of Gaudí's original models, which forced the actual artisans to reconstruct his vision from fragments, which is absolutely amazing. Today it remains under construction, with completion targeted for 2026, marking the century of Gaudí's death. When finished, it will be the tallest church in the world at 172 metres. Wow. Now, if we look at this from another angle, Derek, what's your emotional reaction to a project that spans more than 140 years?
Well, it's a bit of a mix of awe and humility. Like I guess, you're physically dwarfed by the building when you're near it. But when you think about the number of people who have touched and worked on it over 140 years, when you think about how short your working career is, and I guess just being a small part of it, you imagine being a stonemason and having your hands on that building and then being able to step back and there'd be some that have never seen the grandeur of what it's become. But it does make you feel like a very small part of, the human journey when you go and visit a building like this. When you think about our modern world and, you're under pressure all the time for sort of quarterly reporting and project methodologies for IT now are into sort of sprints, and it doesn't really fit with a building that's been a project effectively for 140 years. It makes me wonder about some of the other infrastructure projects that countries take on, and do you have to actually frame them differently and think about them differently in terms of like how you financially measure them? Because I don't think our traditional MPV models actually work for buildings like this. It's a real outlier, I think. I think this church probably is the one that's been under construction for the longest period of time. And even though they've now finished the towers there, and you're sort of asking the tour guide, like, when does this thing end? There's still a further construction plan for the project that requires them to acquire a bunch of properties that are adjacent to the church. And at the moment, the owners of those properties are not interested in selling, and it's sort of like, oh, well, that's okay. We'll just wait. They've been at it for 140 years, so we'll just wait till eventually they have an owner, and we'll acquire them, and we'll complete the vision. And you just go, well, that's just an amazing mindset, isn't it, in terms of constructing something. So, like I hope that sort of as we start to think about some of the Olympic infrastructure that we have to construct in Brisbane, that, we get something that's visionary, something that we're going to be proud of, and something that sort of generates, I guess, this sort of income over a very long time. And like, if you want a local Australian example, I think the Sydney Opera House was probably one of those as well, where blew its budget out and everyone of the day said, like, what are we doing here? And it's now iconic. It's part of the branding for Sydney, and it draws people from all around the world. And when you stand at the base of the Sydney Opera House, you again get that sense of, wow, this building is something really special. So it's good that we've got one. We actually built the Sydney Opera House faster than this building, so maybe we're one up on them.
Derek, when I think of the Sydney Opera House, it took 14 years to build, which seems quite impressive when we compare it to Sagrada Familia. But what's even more impressive is Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. I recorded the podcast exploring this amazing building, and I really encourage our listeners to take a listen to that podcast. Hagia Sophia was built in 532 AD in what was then called Constantinople. It's 82 metres long, 73 metres wide. The dome is 33 metres across and sits 55 metres high into the sky. What's most incredible about this building, it was built from concept to completion, I'll repeat that, concept to completion, in just 5 years and 10 months. And it is still standing strong 1,500 years later. It survived major earthquakes and a whole lot more. For over 1,000 years, it was the largest church in the world. Then, for 400 years, a mosque. Then, for another 100 years, a museum, and has recently returned to a mosque again. In this case, the original designers, a mathematician and a physicist, saw their building complete, although I think they could not have imagined its legacy. Now, while in contrast, Eric took us through Cologne Cathedral, and that's a wonderful podcast that I encourage our listeners to go and listen to. And what blew me away with that, Derek, was it took 600 years to build.
600?
600 years, and there was a pause in the middle for 300 years, and the cranes were there for 300 years, and the actual locals over that period started to use them as weather vanes. So these old cranes, so they're on time scales that just amaze me when we think about the construction. And again, like here is, how do you maintain the intent? Like, how did they maintain Gaudí's intent? Just like the Cologne Cathedral. And again, they found the drawings as well, Derek. They actually found, for 300 years it was on hold, and someone then found the drawings, and they kicked off that project again in the 1800s. So documentation's pretty cool.
It is.
Now, Derek, can you tell us about some other interesting facets of the church?
Well, I think you touched on one already. He wasn't the first architect, so he was, in effect, sort of the second choice. So that's sort of interesting. I think, as I recall, he passed away sort of tragically in an accident. I think he was hit by a tram or something. That's sort of what ended his life. And he was, as you said, living and working on the site. So that's a pretty interesting sort of background story in terms of the man that was has created the vision. The building itself has got like a really international flavour to it. So stones to build this building have been sourced all around the world. And some of the people who've made contributions to this church have also got an international flavour. One of the ones that sort of stood out when we did the tour is this Japanese sculptor who arrived in Barcelona in 1978. And he was so activated by Gaudí's vision that he converted and became a Catholic. And he then spent over 4 decades creating sculptures for the building, including these like really bright visual ceramics that are at the base of some of the towers. So it had a real impact on the overall story. I think there is 500 individual works by him. All of the 4 doors on the activity facade were by him. He's been awarded these prizes to recognise his efforts. He's got this saying that is like, the stone led me to the Sagrada Familia, and then the Sagrada Familia led me to Gaudí, and then Gaudí led me to God. You can sort of say that that's not the story of an employee, that's someone whose life was completely transformed by this project. The third thing I guess we've also touched on is this concept of the stone forest when you walk in. So the columns branch overhead, and the stained glass floods sort of colour onto those columns, and so it's just an awe-inspiring sort of design. And I'm not so sure, that this is before they had modern structural design software packages. I guess someone did hand calculations to sort of convince themselves it was going to stand up, but Gaudi's deliberate engineering of that structure is amazing, and it's just so much spirituality built into it, including his precise selection of the light through those windows. Probably the last interesting thing about the building is that there's 18 towers. Each represent a different biblical figure, with the tallest one being dedicated to Jesus Christ. That's the one that is now 172.5 metres. But curiously enough, Gaudi said it can only be that height. It can't be any higher because there's a particular hill, and he believed that no human creation should surpass God's natural creation. So he's just made it a bit smaller than this particular reference mountain. And so that's a bit of a philosophy that's also pretty interesting, that even to that extent he was keeping sort of God in his design philosophy.
What I find fascinating about Gaudi and some of these people that design these fantastic things, well, Gaudi designed really a project he knew he would never finish. So what does that tell us about long-term strategic thinking when the likelihood is the great projects, we will not be there to see them done? So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it shows that the most powerful strategies are not plans. They're actually visions with real convictions. So Gaudi wasn't managing the project. He was trying to transmit a vision so clearly and completely that it then survived his absence. And you can see in the years he spent creating plaster models and doing these geometric studies and linking it to nature. So he created all these symbolic frameworks, and they then became the instructions for the architects who came after him to follow and deliver on his vision. You often hear in strategy people talking about the North Star, sort of that guiding light. That's where we all need to be recruited to. So the idea is that if you can articulate the destination with enough clarity and enough emotional conviction, that you're able to recalibrate the path as you go without losing that sense of direction. And clearly, Gaudi achieved that because he wasn't around for the entire journey. The building's now had 7 chief architects since him, and as you said, survived the war. We haven't talked a lot about it, but it adapted to computer-aided design, and some of the manufacturing techniques they use now are very modern. But anyone who looks back at Gaudi's original intent, they can look at the building today and say, yep, that is his vision. And that's a strategic durability over 140 years is just amazing and very rare.
If we take that on a little bit further, I'm also reflecting on how do you balance staying true to a vision while adapting to new realities? And for this particular church, they had wars, they had civil wars, they had all these new realities continually coming on. So I'm curious to know, how do you, when you reflect on your career, adapt to the new realities?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that this is about sort of distinguishing between purpose and method. Gaudi had a purpose, and that is that this building was going to embody the sacred through the use of nature's geometry. And he never changed that vision, and that stuck with the building through its 140 years. But the methods used to deliver this building over time have evolved dramatically. So, he never imagined that computer-aided design was going to play a part in it. I guess in my working life, I joined an organisation just as a fairly charismatic and meaningful CEO was departing. And what was interesting was CEOs that came after him tried to put their own footprint on the organisation. But the strength of the vision and the purpose of this first CEO really stuck in the business over successive CEOs. It was really hard to rub out the vision and purpose that this CEO had created. And I found that quite interesting, that despite people's best efforts to sort of move on, people were really recruited to his vision for how organisations should configure and run. So that was interesting.
Derek, that's really interesting around that CEO that was there when you started. And it makes me reflect on that this project spans generations. So what does it take to build a strategy that lasts beyond a single leader? So obviously that CEO impacted you and his strategy impacted you, and you felt that it continued to impact on the business. Can you talk through some of those ideas?
So I think the parallel is that, Gaudi's vision was beyond the interests of the person who created it. It wasn't the Gaudi's vision was never about himself. It was about something much larger than himself, and it was the connection to the spiritual and God and linking the environment to those visions. And so I think that was true of the CEO I'm referencing. He very low ego, and it was not about himself. It was about how to make a business run differently and how to sustain culture to actually give a different result. And that did survive beyond when he left the organisation. I think you've got to be very good at being able to externalise the vision and make it legible to the people who are trying to follow it. So you can't have a vision that just lies on one person's head, otherwise it can die with them, or when they leave, no one can follow it. And you can see that in the years that Gaudi spent putting his models and geometry and documented principles into something that other people could follow. I guess the third thing is so it's not about ownership, it's about stewardship. So the craftsmen who were following Gaudi's vision, they weren't trying to impose their own vision on the building. So you're trying to faithfully interpret what Gaudi's vision was, and that means it's a sort of a disciplined stewardship to deliver on the vision. And that sometimes is rare as people want to put their own sort of stamp on something.
Derek, thank you so much for your time. I'll bring our time together to a conclusion. And as I think about it, La Sagrada Familia is more than a building. It's a lesson in patience, vision, and collective effort. Especially when I think it wasn't funded by the government. It was everybody else donating their time to do this and money. It shows what happens when a project becomes bigger than any one person, carried forward by generations who believe in its purpose. Derek, the connections you've drawn today between Gaudi's adaptive genius and the way we think about strategy, documentation, and legacy have given me a completely new way at looking at this building and also at all the other buildings that were built in the past and questioning some of our major buildings that we'll build into the future. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about this impressive building. And I'd say to any listener, if you haven't been to Barcelona, then it should be on your bucket list. I would plan to go and stand inside this building on a clear afternoon and marvel at that height. And whatever your background or beliefs are, you will walk away thinking differently about what humans are able to achieve together.
Beautifully put. Thank you for joining me on this journey and Derek through one of history's most extraordinary long-term projects. Until next time, keep looking to the past for leadership lessons that shape our future. Goodbye.